Okay, so we are now connected to SharePoint. We are using its REST web services to go out and retrieve data. In this lesson, we're going to focus on utilizing the abstracted SharePoint service class it created in the last lesson in our React components within the web part application that we're building. And what we ultimately want to do with this web part is we want to allow it to display some sort of chart or visualization of some SharePoint list data that we retrieve and pull into the web part itself. So in order to set that up, let's go ahead and create a new component in our components folder over here on the left. And we're just going to create a component called chart.tsx. And in this file, we will import star as React from React, and we will export default class chart extends react.component. This will have both props and state, so we can go ahead and set up interfaces for those now. And in this case, I'm actually going to create these interfaces right at the top of this file above our chart class itself. Again, you can choose to organize your classes and your interfaces however you want within your solution. It really doesn't matter. So we'll just try kind of a different method, and you can see how you like that whenever we're building out this web part. So we'll export interface chart props, and then that will have, for now, let's just put a single prop in here called chart title, and that'll be of type string. And we'll take that interface and we'll inform our web part right here that it's going to use those chart props. We'll do the same thing with export interface chart state. And within this interface, we're going to have an array of list items. So we'll create an items array, which will be of type list item array. And we need to import that at the top of our file. So let's import list item from, and let's go back up to our services folder, and then we'll go into SharePoint /list item right there. And with that interface created, let's inform our class that it has a state, and then we can go ahead and build out our first methods within this chart component class. So let's create a constructor, which is going to set props of type chart props. That's going to run a super call with those props. And we'll have our bind methods placeholder and set initial state as always, where this dot state is going to equal a new object, which has an empty array of items. We'll also create our public render method, which is going to return a jsx.element. And let's just set up some HTML for now, where we have a div and then an h1 with this dot props dot chart title. Great. So we've kind of scaffolded out or set up this chart component that you see here. Let's go ahead and import that into our dash component, which is the top level React component for this web part. And at the top here, we'll just put import chart from chart. And we can delete all of this boilerplate from our render method and simply put in a new chart with a chart title of my new chart for now. And as soon as we save this, you'll see in the local workbench, all that boilerplate is going to disappear, and we're just going to get our very simple React component that we're building. And of course, down in the React Dev Tools, you'll see there is our chart component, which has a chart title prop and an items array in its state. Cool. So let's close our dash component because we're just going to be focusing on our chart component for now. And let's see just how easy it's going to be to import our SharePoint service, our web services abstraction class, and utilize that to actually retrieve some data inside of a React component. So what we're going to do first of all is let's come down here below our H1. Let's add a button that'll simply say refresh. So whenever you click on the refresh button, it'll load some data from our web services. And let's create a method that we can utilize to bind to the on click of that button. So this will be public get items, which will be return type void. And that will use SharePoint service dot get list items. And again, this does require a list ID. And in this case, we do have a dummy list that we want to work with in our actual live SharePoint environment. So I'm going to open this up in a new tab so you guys can kind of just see how this is set up. If I go to site contents on the site we're currently working on, you'll see we have this list called Lemonade Stand Earnings. And you can set up your own list. Doesn't really matter what list you connect to, but again, because we're going to be doing some charting stuff in upcoming lessons, it's probably good to have some kind of numeric data in there. And we're even going to provide the list data you see here as a spreadsheet you can download in the video description down below in case you want to work with the exact same data that you see in the recording. But basically, in this list, we just have rows for years, and then within each year, you have a total, and then the total broken down by quarter of your earnings for each of those quarters. And this is just a silly example that's going to give us some data that we can work with, that we can just kind of play around with as we're starting to utilize a lot of these features. So we're going to kind of automate how we can get the ID of this list in the future, but if you want to actually get that when you're just viewing it in the web browser, you can browse to the list settings here, and you'll notice up in the web address, you'll see it says list equals, and then there is actually the ID of the list there. And the list ID actually starts after the %7b. That's just a URL encoding for a left curly bracket. And the same thing on the right, %7d is a right curly bracket. So you only want to select what's in between those symbols, so which is, in this case, it starts with a 9 and ends with a 034. And then we're going to go ahead and copy that, and we can now use that inside of our code here to make sure that we're connecting to the correct list. And now that we have that, we'll say .then with our items. We will take those and we'll do something with them. And in this case, what we'll do is we'll actually, let me scroll down a little bit so we can focus on this. But what we'll actually do is we're going to say this.setState. Our items in our state is now going to equal the items.value from our response. So we're basically just going to update our state to now equal the .value property of the response that came back. So this is a list item collection, which again has a value property, which is an array. So we're updating the items array with a new array based on what comes back from these web services. And we do need to bind the this keyword to this method because we are using that. So let's come up here and we'll say this.getItems equals this.getItems.bind this. And then once that's done, that's all we have to do to be able to retrieve data and load it into the state of this component. So let's give that a test on the remote workbench. We'll give that a refresh. In our React Dev Tools, let's select our dash and then our chart web part. And you can see it has empty state. But whenever we click on the refresh button, nothing happens because I forgot to bind the button on click. So let's do that really quick. We'll set on click equals this.getItems. You need to do that. You need to actually do something when the button is clicked. So let's try that again. We'll give this a refresh. In our dev tools down here, let's make sure we have the chart selected so we can see the state. And if I click refresh after a moment, it'll actually load 7 items into our items state down here. And each one of these items is all of the data that you get back regarding the items in this particular list. Likewise, if we try this over on the local workbench, if I were to do the same thing, you'll see when we click refresh, it's going to load up our sample items, which maybe aren't the same thing, but we kind of have some similar sort of numeric data in there. And this is going to allow us to test this locally, even though we aren't connected to a real SharePoint environment, which is great. So it's fairly easy to load this into state, and now that this is in state, all we would have to do is come in and write an iterator to actually visualize these in our component, in this chart component in this case. So for example, I could say this.state.items.map, and then for each item, let's take that and return a new HTML element, which will be a list item, and we could say strong, and within that strong tag, we can have item.title. We know a title exists on these items, and in parentheses, we could put item.id. And let's wrap all of this in an unordered list. So we get a nice bulleted list of items after the state has been updated. So in our local workbench, we'll click on refresh. You'll see all the sample data listed out there. We'll do the same thing after we refresh in our remote workbench, and it's actually going to show us real list items from that list. And we are getting an error here. That's because we didn't add a key. So it's probably a good idea to always pass a unique key. In this case, we don't even need a counter because we know that the item.id is going to be unique. So we can just use item.id as the key for each of these list items. As long as it's unique, you can use it. You don't necessarily have to have a zero-based index for those keys. So again, let's come back here and refresh. You'll see it's going to work just fine in the console. Let me clear it just to make sure. Let's refresh here. And when we click refresh, we don't get any warnings down at the bottom. Very good. So with this done, we've kind of demonstrated very quickly how you can take your SharePoint service and you can load the results of that into the state of your component and then display that. And that was fairly easy to do. All we had to do was just kind of wire up an on-click, have it handle something and use our SharePoint service whenever that click actually executes. However, there are some best practices here that we really should make use of. In particular, we need to let the user know when an operation is in progress. So for example, in our remote workbench, if I were to switch over to our network tab and our dev tools here, and I were to switch this, well, let's refresh the page first so we can kind of have it empty so you'll actually see it loading. But if I were to switch our throttling to slow 3G, you'll see when I click refresh, I might click refresh again while we're waiting for that response because I can't tell that it's waiting to get something back. So you might have users click over and over and over, and it's just going to get slower and slower and slower because it's going to be waiting on multiple requests. So first of all, it's a good idea to let users know when you're loading, when you're waiting on a response to actually come back. And in order to do that, we can update our state at the top of the file here to just simply say loading of type Boolean. And then so that'll indicate whether or not you're loading in this web part. And we could down here in our initial state set loading to false. And if we go down to our get items method, what we need to do is we need to turn that loading state on before we make this request and then turn it back off once the request has resolved. So up here above, we can say this.set state, loading is true. And then we'll, when we set our state with our new items, we can set loading back to false. So we're kind of turning it on and then turning it back off. And now that we've done this, let's come up and we actually have to somehow change our render template to inform the user that that is actually loading. So what we can do is replace our refresh label here with the ternary operator that says this.state.loading. And if that's true, we can just make the label of our button say loading. Otherwise, it can say refresh as normal. And what that'll do is once we refresh our remote workbench here, let's turn on our network throttling so we can see just how that message pops up. And as soon as I click refresh, you'll see it says loading. And when it's done, it goes back to refresh. So that's a nice, easy way to provide that feedback. It's probably also a good idea to actually disable the button when you're loading. So we can just do that by binding the disabled attribute to this.state.loading. And so whenever we are loading, it'll actually disable the button so the user can't click on it again while you're waiting for a request. So let's go back here and give that a shot. Again, just so we can see that, let's turn on slow 3G throttling. And when we click refresh, it's kind of hard to tell there, but it grayed out the border a bit and you can't actually click on it while it's loading. Normally in your CSS styles, you could do more with that to kind of indicate it's actually disabled, but we're going to leave it for now and you can test that out on your own if you want to check that out. Great. So another thing we want to make sure we do is we can handle errors and inform the user when something actually goes wrong. And just as an example, so we can indicate an error occurred here, let's go into our SharePoint service and on our get list items method, let's just put in something here that we know doesn't exist. So /_API/blah, just something that is going to cause an error whenever we try to request from this endpoint. And by changing that, now when the user makes this request, when they click on refresh, it's going to go out and try to retrieve data from an endpoint that doesn't exist. However, we're not handling the error state in this case. So what'll happen is when we actually make this request, you'll see in our network panel here, let me filter by items so we can see that pop up there, but we'll hit refresh. And you'll see down here, we have the items which resulted in 404 not found because that endpoint doesn't exist. So we actually got an error on that. And the same thing could happen if you, for example, lost connectivity while you were waiting. There's just lots of things that can go wrong whenever you're working with web services, and you shouldn't count on and just kind of cross your fingers and hope everything works great, because most of the time it will, but you should handle errors when they occur. And you'll see in this case, what has happened is our loading state is stuck on true because we went out, we started our request, but we never actually executed any of the code in this .then function down here because our request was never successful. It never resolved with a successful promise. So in order to fix this, we need to simply .catch our error, and then with that we can do something to indicate to the user that, hey, there was an error. There was a problem with your request. So what we'll actually do is we'll go up to our state and we'll create yet another state property. We can call this error, which will be of type string or null. So you're either going to have no error at all, or you'll have some sort of string that describes what the error is in this case. And down here in this .state, we do need to set an initial error state of null, so there's no error by default. But then in our render template, we can say if this .state.error, then output a paragraph with this .state.error. So if we have a value, or if this is truthy, then go ahead and put a paragraph tag there that's going to show the error message itself. And what we can do now is down here, now that we have that, we can set this .set state just like we do in our success function up above. But in this case, we're going to set the error state to something went wrong. We also want to make sure we disable the loading state, because again, we are stuck in loading right now because this is never set back to false. So we'll also set loading back to false because we are done loading. Even though it failed, we are completed with a loading process there. So we'll set that to false in both instances. And as we refresh, let's go ahead and click on our refresh button to test this out. And you'll see that message will pop up that says something went wrong. And it allows us to retry that over and over, and it's going to show the message. Now, the only other thing we'll want to fix is that there could be a feasible scenario where you get an error message, but then you click on refresh and you have a successful attempt. In this case, that's not happening because we just have a bad URL, but you can imagine if somebody went offline and they came back online and make another request. As of now, this error message will never actually disappear. So let's make sure that we turn that back off whenever we have a successful request. And we can do that just by, in our success method right here, we'll set the error state to null anytime we are successful. And let's go back into our SharePoint service and we'll just delete this blah silliness from there. We'll go back to a working application, and when we click on refresh, we should go back to actually getting our list items in the web part. Awesome. So we are getting closer to actually visualizing our chart data inside of this web part. We're actually pulling in some list items in this case, and we are displaying them in the web part. We're also handling the loading state and the error state, which are very important things that you should always do when working with web services and your components. In upcoming lessons, we're going to learn how we can take this very boring bulleted list that you see here and start to plug that into some external libraries to make it really something quite different.